I'll just talk on essentially what are force fluctuations at the nanoscale and also beyond. When I say nanoscale, essentially I mean length scales, but I shall also talk about time scales and also in terms of charge. When I'm talking of picocoulombs, things like that, provided we have sufficient time. So there are two parts of this talk. Firstly, I'll talk about force fluctuations at the nanoscale in biological systems. How do we model it using physical models? And if we have time, I'll also talk about fluctuations in hydrodynamic system. For example, a gas bubble which is being forced by a acoustic wave. So essentially, when we talk of length scales, when you talk of nanoscales, what we actually think of are proteins, lipid molecules, membranes, persistence lengths of macromolecules. That is, for example, till what length a tangent drawn to a curve, or tangent drawn on a DNA strand, for example, maintains its distance. That's your persistence length. Then you have things like cells, vesicles, gas bubbles, and fluids, which are on the micro scales, micrometers. And of course, you have other macro scale things which you see in everyday life: combustion problems, normal hydrodynamic problems, things like that. Now, the question that we are seeking to address is whether approximations that are made at the macro scale hold even at the smaller length scales, whether they hold right up to the micro scale, whether they hold up to the nanoscale. And also we want to see what role local geometry plays in determining the physics and the mechanics of a system, essentially affect the macroscopic properties of a substance. So these are what we are trying to address. And as an example, we shall first look at a simple biological problem. Well, not so simple, but it looks simple. Essentially, how nanotubulation occurs when you pull at a vesicle. I'll tell you what a vesicle is, and what are the dynamics involved in the force fluctuations that are seen in this nanotubulation phenomena. And this has been done in collaboration with Professor Ananth Krishna at MRC and ISC. So what I'll first talk about is what are vesicles, what do I mean by nanotubulation, the motivation for this work. I shall compare it with experiments. Lastly, of course, applications of this work. So vesicles essentially are bags which are made up of phospholipid membranes. For example, a lipid molecule consists of, looks something like this. It's of the order of 3 nanometers. Part of it is a hydrophilic head. That is, it is water loving, and you have a huge hydrophobic tail, so it is water hating. So when these lipid molecules self-assemble, that is, they come together, they'll assemble so that the tail part of it, the hydrophobic tail, stays away from the surrounding water. So you see this kind of configuration. You have the heads which are going outwards, tails are tucked in so that they have least contact with water. And when they self-assemble, they come together due to intermolecular forces, they form what could be called a unilamellar structure, which is a micelle, or it could be a bilamellar structure, which is called a liposome. And you could have bilayer sheets, or you could have various other things, multilamellar structures, which are called vesicles, and so on. So just to reiterate, the dimension of this molecule is of the order of around 3 to 5 nanometers. And the question is, how does it affect what we see macroscopically, macroscopic measurements? Now, vesicles are essentially bags in the cell which transport chemicals from one part of the cell to the other, or transport chemicals between cells. For example, in the neuron, the vesicle is the container which transport neurotransmitters across the neuronal synapse, and firing of the neuron takes place. Fluctuations in the concentration of neurotransmitters plays an important role when you are trying to synchronize neurons. For example, if you have over-synchronization, epilepsy takes place. And various other structures, various other biological contexts are there where vesicles play their role. For example, within mitochondria. Now, the problem we are interested in is what happens when you physically pull at a vesicle. When you pull at it, what happens is nanotubulation occurs. Essentially, a tubule of nanometer cross-section, uniform cross-section, gets pulled out from a vesicle which is of the order of a few micrometers. Possible applications of this is, of course, in making small microreactor or network systems which can be used for drug delivery applications, or if if you have very minute amounts of chemicals and you want to look at what kind of chemicals are there, if you want to analyze it, you can't use a test tube. You need a very tiny container. And that's what a vesicle will serve for. So first I'll just go over the experimental observations that are seen when you pull at a vesicle mechanically. These are results of Cuvelier and company from Institut Curie in Paris, and also some other results from Rupa and Shivashankar. Shivashankar who is now at NCBS, who was at NCBS and was at Singapore University. What you do is, this is your main vesicular body. You either attach it to a pipette, which is connected to a lipid reservoir, or you put the vesicle on a slide, glass slide, pull at it by the tip of an AFM, and you measure the force versus extension. You are pulling at it at constant velocity. So there are two possibilities that you see. First, you have a steep rise in the force extension curve, then there's a steep drop, and then you see these serrations throughout. And all of this is at the same level. You have a plateau. Or you can have a steep rise, a drop, and then you have this gently rising plateaus going upwards. And you also note experimentally that these lower plateaus correspond to vesicles which are of higher radial cross sections. So for example, if you have a 1 micrometer vesicle, it might look something like that, whereas a 5 micrometer vesicle would show something like this. Question is, why does this happen? How can you control this? The other question is, all these serrations, is it just noise? Is it just thermal noise? So there are various people who have worked on this, on the theory of this problem, trying to explain these curves. You had a group in British Columbia and Boston University, Ivan Evans and collaborators, Hochmuth at Duke, Shivashankar, as I told you, the Institut Curie group, and various other American and English groups. And the problem is, none of these guys have ever looked at the dynamics, the time dependence of the system. They just looked at equilibrium systems and tried to explain this, tried to explain the broad curve. The assumption made by most of the people who have been working in this and have been publishing the literature is that all of this is just noise.
How do they do these experiments?
Okay, so you take a vesicle, stick it on a glass slide, then get an AFM tip and pull at it. Because you'll have some local electrostatics, the AFM tip and the vesicle adhere locally, and it gets pulled along. Then and it's done at constant velocity.
You have to measure the force.
Yes. So now what is done is the tip is essentially trapped in a potential well, right? The machine, AFM tip. So you look at the local displacement of the spring in the machine, and you see how much displacement is there, how much force is there. You know the spring constant, so you can measure the force. So that's how it's done. So one way is putting it on a glass slide and pulling it by an AFM. The other, so you get these kind of curves for those. The other thing is to keep the surface tension constant in the vesicle by connecting it to a lipid reservoir by means of a pipette. Then you adhere a glass bead or a polystyrene bead of a few microns in dimension. Bring it here, and then when it sticks, pull it. So same principle.
Would the spring constant thing be affected by relations in this last thing?
Right. So you know the spring constant of the machine. So that is a known quantity. The whole business of modeling it is to get the spring constant of the vesicle.
No, so what I'm saying is that the force will be amplified or not based on whether or not there's a local relation in the glass surface on which it is like.
Yes. So of course you have those imperfections, but the point is okay. All that will come in, but what I'm trying to say is when people talk of this as thermal noise, that's a problem there because. 1 second. Okay. These serrations are of order say 6 to 8 piconewtons. Okay. So 6 into 10 to the power minus 12 newtons. Now the dimensions of the lipid molecule is of order of 3 nanometers. 3 or say 5 nanometers. And the dimensions of your vesicle, that globule, is of the order of a few microns, say 10 microns or something. Now if you assume that it's just thermal noise, then any force that you try to put in for for each molecule to overcome the local curvature should not really be comparable to this quantity. This should actually match to thermal noise if it were really thermal noise. Now thermal noise is just what KT. K is Boltzmann's constant, 10 to the minus 23 of the order of that. This is temperature is say 300 Kelvin, so you should get something which is much smaller than this. On the other hand, if you look at the dimensions of each lipid molecule and you look at the curvature it has to overcome, just make a back of envelope calculation, you notice that that comes to around 6 to 8 piconewtons, exactly as what you see. Which is why that was the initial motivation to say why this is not thermal noise. That's why we thought this can't be thermal noise, this is rather some dynamical effect that's coming through on this serrations. So anyway, so I'll go ahead. So what we had done for modeling this kind of system is to consider the frictional effects between lipid layers. I told you that a vesicle is a multilamellar membrane, consists of a multilamellar membrane, phospholipid membrane. It could be 2 layers, 3 layers, n number of layers, you don't know. So when they are being pulled, you're going to have frictional effects between them, and that's going to cause those serrations. That's our initial that was our idea. You're going to have frictional effects between the lipid layers. Also, this is essentially a bag which is having a fluid which is not exactly a Newtonian fluid. You have a polyelectrolyte kind of fluid inside, so you're going to have dissipative drag due to the surrounding fluid when you're pulling at it. And this is a membrane, a balloon surface, say, so you're going to have elastic behavior of this membrane when you're pulling at it. Lastly, when you pull at it beyond a point, you're going to have smooth flow. So now you forget about the elastic behavior, now you go into the plastic regime. You have a yield point beyond which flow is smooth. So you have to account for that. Then you have stick-slip behavior in the sense that when each of these phospholipid molecules are moving out, you saw that you had a polar head and 2 tails. When they're pulled out, they're going to stick to each other and slip, stick to each other and slip. So you're going to have stick-slip behavior. And lastly,
those characteristics are affected by the thermal noise.
Thermal noise is actually much smaller than those serrations. That's why the whole thermal noise will not give you serrations of 10 piconewtons. Thermal noise is less by an order of 10. So if it was thermal noise, you shouldn't be getting those huge fluctuations. That is the main gist of the motivation. So you have all this elastic, plastic, hydrodynamic behavior, and of course the major change, other contribution to this system is you have a change in geometry. From a sphere you're going to deform it to a vesicle and then to a tube. So your curvature energy plays a role. So one of the principal assumptions we have made in this in modeling the system is that the total vesicle, total volume enclosed by this vesicle is constant, which is kind of self-evident since this volume is not going anywhere, right? It is there, and so you are stuck with it. For some reason, previous theoreticians have made an assumption of constant surface area rather than constant volume, which is, in my opinion, doesn't make too much sense. So what we are actually claiming, just to repeat, is that the small dynamics at the nanoscale is going to show up in the macroscopic scale, what we are actually observing, and we are going to model it such that we are able to explain all the features of that force extension curve that you saw. So what we are saying is the volume, the initial volume of the vesicle is going to be conserved throughout. So at any subsequent time t, the volume of the ellipsoid vesicle is going plus the volume of the tube plus the volume of the neck region is going to be equal to the initial volume. That's what we are doing. So what we have done is, using volume conservation, we kind of find out what the geometry of the vesicle looks at any time t, and we get an expression for the radius of the main vesicular body related to the initial vesicular radius, the distance the neck has been pulled out, and the radius of the neck region and the radius of the tube. LM is the maximal region, maximal length to which the neck can be pulled out before tube formation occurs. So this can be calculated from the theory of elasticity standard. You have a theory of elastic shells, pull at it and you can find out what the maximal force required.
How do you know that the vesicle will not have ruptured or something? It will rupture at some force.
Yes, but the point is for in experiments what are reported is you have a micrometer kind of vesicle and you are pulling out a nanotube for several micrometers. So it's essentially the vesicle is at one end of the room and it has come here and it's still going on. So all reported, at some point it will rupture, true, but reported experiments have been such that for all practical purposes it hasn't ruptured. If you apply too much force, apply a jerk, it will rupture, but this is at constant velocity. Not constant force but constant velocity. So the point to remember is that this is not a small point object like you normally deal with. When you deal with point objects, balls or something, it's a point object, dynamics is clear. Here you have an elongated object, you have viscoelastic behavior, it's no longer Newtonian behavior, force is not proportional to displacement. Newtonian behavior, so because of the fluid, you have dissipation, you have elasticity and you have plastic flow here. So all these, you have feedback such that you have to keep on regulating your force to maintain constant velocity. Okay. So what you are actually always monitoring is, you're monitoring the velocity at which you're pulling and you're looking at the displacement. Of course, you're looking at your watch also, so that you have, yeah.
So to do an accurate, for example, if you take a macroscopic object like a balloon and you could do something similar,
Right.
you probably can characterize it using a reasonably simple extension of Newton's laws with something.
Right.
What are the, so, and you get essentially some ODE plus a PD for the shape.
Right.
What is the difference when you come into here?
The difference here is that you have this whole membrane is not a fixed membrane. This membrane is sliding out to form the tube. So you have two layers that, think of it as two tectonic plates, say. They're sliding, stick slip is jerking. Say, suppose you're pulling sellotape, say. If you pull at it, sometimes you hear a sound, right? So that is stick slip. You are exceeding the force required to overcome local friction, then there's smooth flow. Again you have friction, so again you have jerky flow, things like that. In balloon that doesn't happen, you just have an elastic membrane that's being pulled. You don't have viscoelastic behavior, you don't have dissipation, you don't have those problems.
Just a question, because it's at the micrometer, the nanometer scale, are there not the confounding effects from, say, electromagnetic forces?
Right, so when we talk of viscoelastic behavior, we are kind of putting the whole thing into a friction thing. We are not, the idea was if you look into too much detail, if you are going to model it macromolecule, molecule by molecule, we are going to run into trouble. We don't know how to do it. That is why this is here you'll notice when I show you the final equation, we don't write an equation of motion. I write a force balance equation. So all your other forces is being stuffed into what I call a dissipative term. So it gets subsumed into other terms without actually considering it piece by piece. So, okay, considering volume conservation, we get this kind of expression for the radius of the main vesicular body at any time t. One expression is there when tube formation hasn't occurred, that is when we are still at this stage, and one expression when tube formation has started coming. Okay, so one of the main contributions to the forces that you need to apply is comes from the change in geometry, which is rather drastic. A sphere is getting deformed into an ellipsoid. So what you do is you look at the curvature energy. What's the change in curvature energy for the sphere to go from a sphere to an ellipsoid? And for that you need to know the curvature modulus of this material. So that is measurable. So curvature modulus essentially is the energy required to overcome the natural curvature. You have two things known as Gaussian curvature and natural curvature for the system. How do you overcome that? So you have a quantity which is a characteristic of the material.
The thing is, this is done in 2D or 3D?
3D.
But I don't see a Z in.
No, because I'm just looking at volume conservation, right? I'm just looking at pulling out. So what I'm interested in is in the force extension curve is extension along one dimension. So in that sense, it's 1D. But 3D is coming because it's volume conservation. Okay, one assumption that's being made is all flow is, this flow in the longitudinal direction is much larger than in the meridional direction. That is that assumption is being made.
Atomic effects and discreteness at the atomic level is not that significant.
We didn't, yeah, so we didn't make any of those assumptions. So it's broadly a classical model, and we found it sufficient. So evidently, you don't need to look into atomic level details. Right, so we get this kind of force for changing this sphere into an ellipsoid. So you have a curvature term, and lastly, because you have, it's after all an elastic membrane, you also have an elastic contribution term. You also have a couple of other terms because you have an increase in surface area when you're pulling at the changing the sphere to an ellipsoid. You have an increase in surface area, and when neck formation takes place, again you have an elastic contribution from the neck. That's this last term. I won't go into details, but anyway, K here, K sigma is, which I am calling it a kind of spring constant. You can also think of it as surface tension. This is essentially a surface tension term. Okay, so we have done that. Now we have gotten an ellipsoid from a sphere. Now we are going to change it, so we are going to pull it out so that you have a plate which is being pulled out, so a thin plate of a few lipid molecule thickness. For that we apply a standard theory from Landau and Lifshitz about theory of shells. If you have a shell and you pull at it, what's the force required to cause an elongation? So this is pretty standard. If you look at Landau and Lifshitz theory of elasticity, it's a standard book. You can get an expression for this. And that's this term where E is your Young's modulus, and it's related to E prime by various other quantities like Poisson's ratio. Now the broad assumptions being made is that you have a sphere, then an ellipsoid, then a cone formation occurs, then you have a tube. That's the broad model. But it's strictly not a cone. What is happening is locally when you're pulling at it, that's going to be a local curvature where the lipid membrane kind of bends. You have something like this, you're pulling at it, so you have a local indent at that point. So when any lipid molecule is coming from the main body of the vesicle, it has to overcome this local curvature. So you have to include one more term, yet another term, which takes into account the curvature of the local geometry, essentially the local geometry of the vesicle. So you have curvature energy coming in because of the change from sphere to ellipsoid. You also have it because you have a local curvature here, and that is this particular thing, and you can approximate it as the value you will get when the total neck has formed, and you get this kind of expression. H max is the maximal height of the neck region. LM also, actually LM and H max are the same thing. I have by mistake written this. Right, so just as we did from sphere to ellipsoid, again you have to take into account curvature energy for ellipsoid to tube, and you get this. This is the force required to change the geometry from ellipsoid to tube. And using our earlier expressions, you can relate the radius of the vesicle to the length to which you have pulled it out, Lm. Okay, all that is fine, but now how do you find out Lm? It's easier if you can make further approximations. And we came across a paper by Green, who published in Rheologica Acta, on what happens when you want to model myopia in your eye. So what this Green had done was he thought of the eye as a spheroidal shell, and he looked at flow, plastic flow in the eye. So there he had assumed that you had flow both in the longitudinal and meridional directions, so that you have flow along the axis and flow in this direction also. So we make an approximation that this flow is much larger than this, which enables us to get a simplified expression for the length. This is Lm actually, and the radius of your vesicle. So we get this nice expression. R0 essentially would be the base of your neck region. Okay, so we have been talking of kind of stick slip when we said that lipid molecules are being pulled. A nice analogy to that kind of system can also be found in macroscopic phenomena such as in earthquakes. You have two tectonic plates. You're pulling, one plate is being pulled with some particular force, so stress is being accumulated, keep on pulling, then suddenly you overcome the local friction, then that's a whole jerk, that is your earthquake. Then the whole process repeats. So you have stick, then you have a huge slip, that's your earthquake and release of energy, stick, slip, so on. The same thing can be seen when you look at violin and a bow. The bow sticks to your violin string and sticks to it, keeps on moving, so you hear the wailing noise, then it slips, and the whole process repeats. That's also a stick slip phenomenon. And this kind of earthquake model can be modeled by what is known as your Baryshnikov model, where you have a set of blocks and springs with appropriate spring constants. This is one plate, this is one plate. The reason why I'm showing this is because you can think of this as one lipid layer. This is another lipid layer, and you're going to have stick slip between the two. Such stick slip phenomena have one characteristic which are known as relaxation oscillations, in the sense you have two time scales. You have one large time scale where nothing much happens, which is the stick part of your thing. Then an instantaneous slip, which is a very small time scale compared to the other. So you have stick, slip, and this is your time, and that's your displacement. Another way of looking at stick slip is essentially you have a bowl at the end of a seesaw. You have a weight here, water is flowing here, and the system is rigged so that moment this thing fills, the weight of this is counterbalanced. This part A comes downwards. A comes downwards, the vessel empties, and the seesaw goes up again. So this whole filling phenomena corresponds to your stick part here. The emptying part, that's a one single jerk where it empties, that's your slip, it goes back up. So that's what is happening. Something similar here. So as I said, I can write a force balance equation. This is the equation for the bead at the end of the vesicle. And you have various quantities. This is the applied force. You have the force required due to neck formation, the curvature terms which are there, the sphere to ellipsoid deformation, and the various other local elasticity terms that I told you about, the sphere to tube terms. All this is there. And the dissipative terms essentially are the frictional force, which can be of, you can choose a kind of frictional force, nothing sacred about this, so I won't go into details. You have an elastic term and you have a dissipative term related to the velocity at which it's being pulled.
Why I asked about this thermal noise is that in mechanical systems, these vibrations, it's still, the energy is quite small, frequency of vibration is high. The dynamic friction characteristic very much depends on, it's very different from static friction. Now, the same kind of phenomenon probably would exist here, even though the thermal energy is
true.
small.
That is why, yeah, please.
And modeling that, I don't know how you can go about.
Right. So what is done means this frictional term actually is what is causing part of the serrations, but it doesn't explain the rest of the curve. So those serrations that you saw in the curve, part of it comes from this, but to get the actual curve, okay, if you were to just have this kind of frictional term and forget about the rest of it, you would get smooth jigsaw kind of thing. It doesn't tell you about why it happens in that fashion. And thermal noise magnitude would be much smaller than what you see there. So, okay, maybe partly I am answering what you asked. So, as I initially said, you have two experimental scenarios. One where surface tension is maintained constant because you have a lipid reservoir connected to your vesicle and you're pulling it with a bead. You can't see the nanotube actually. It's a very thin nanotube between this and this. If you switch off the light, maybe we can see it, but I'm not sure. Can you see a very dim thing here? You have to imagine it, I think. Anyway, that's actually a very thin nanotube, because just bear in mind this is of the order of a few micrometers, and this is so 10 raised to minus 6 meters, and this guy is 10 raised to minus 9, so it's 1,000 times smaller than this, so you may not be able to actually see it clearly. So you have two experimental scenarios, one where you have constant surface tension because you have a lipid reservoir connected to this, and the other where surface tension changes because the vesicle is just stuck on a glass surface and you're pulling at it. This kind of surface, this kind of setup gives you such a curve, rise and then serrations at constant height. This thing gives you this kind of rising curves. So what we had done to model it is to assume that the choice of the spring constant, think of the tube as a set of springs which are connected to each other. So if you have a long set of springs and you're pulling at it, the spring constant essentially gets reduced with length. Spring constant gets reduced, but extension is length is increasing, so the restoring force remains constant. That corresponds to something like that. So whether the spring constant is weakening or if it's constant with time determines which system we are actually modeling, this one or this one. So this is what we get. For example, these are force extension curves for constant restoring force. That is K prime is weakening. So you see the serrations, you have a steep rise, you have a kind of constant slope here, rise, comes down, then you see these serrations, which is somewhat similar to what you see here, almost quite similar. This initial part here, which is kind of strange, which goes below zero, is because the machine is being calibrated at this stage, so it hasn't yet started taking measurements at this point. Measurements start taking place here. So you have a rise, a steep rise, fall, then serrations, which is what we see here.
So is this a water wall force between the tip of the AFM and
Yeah. Well, look, think it's more of electrostatics actually. Van der Waals is between the lipid layers. It's more of electrostatic.
So when you get this AFM tip towards that lipid membrane, I normally feel that those are the water wall forces between the tip and the material.
Electrostatic is more dominant actually because Van der Waals is much weaker, right? So
Okay, this is probably a very simple, but you are assuming your system is oscillating.
no, I'm saying that it's well, not. I'm assuming that you are having stick slip between the layers. You're pulling at two layers and they are being dragged.
So when I stop pulling it, we'll go back to its original state.
It should. I'm not looking at that. That's the next.
You're making that assumption with this
No, this is being
spring
pulled.
system, right?
No. See, you have flow from the main vesicular body. You have one layer coming and coming and coming, and all these jerks that you see here, which is what perhaps you are asking, is of each subsequent lipid molecule escaping from the neck.
So my question is, though, you have a spring system that models what in the original problem? You are pulling something in the original problem.
Right. So, okay. So this thing. This part is actually the tubule coming out. This spring constant is the you have two layers, two lipid layers.
So then you're saying that if I don't apply the force anymore, then the tubule will be restored to the original position.
It should, if you, but we are not doing that. In this experiment this model deals only with the case where you have constant pulling velocity. You're not releasing it.
Right, you're not releasing it, but even if you're not releasing it, the fact is if you're assuming this as the model,
Right.
then that's the implicit model, right? And if you release it before.
No, means you're not releasing it because, see, what is happening is you're pulling, this tube is coming out and out. So you have more and more springs joining the line. So there are two possibilities. You have a case where the effective spring constant is reducing with increasing length, or you have a case where this spring constant acts as one gigantic spring with constant. It's a model, one with one constant spring constant.
No, but if I saw this model in isolation, like if somebody just gave me a rocket spring system like this, and I pulled it from one end,
Right.
it would oscillate.
Yeah.
So, but then if you use this to model your system,
No, it would oscillate in the sense, okay, this is actually, this model is a frictional kind of thing. This is say x dot by Vm upon 1 plus x dot by Vm whole square, something like that, pulling at some velocity Vm. So this is not something that is, if you're releasing it, I'll say you are having oscillations, but this is kind of jerk.
Yeah.
So this corresponds to, well, oscillations in the sense you have relaxation oscillations locally, which is what you see in the.
Okay, we'll take this offline. Maybe I'm just missing something from it.
Okay.
So you have discretized, is it? You have put those masses and then, or is it still distributed nature?
It's a continuous system, except that I'm just to show,
Just for
it's just for analogy to show what I'm doing.
So all places are sleeping at the same time and the stationary at the same time.
Yes, the main slipping is occurring at the neck. You're pulling it here, but the dynamics that you see here is happening somewhere here.
Yeah.
So it's kind of propagating through your. So it's not like a normal.
Not a,
It's not a point object, huh? Okay, so we are able to see the force extinction curve just as is seen experimentally, and if you tune the value of your constants, you can get this to be of the correct order of order that is seen experimentally. Now, likewise, you can get, if you have a very high spring constant between the two layers, you can get curves which are going steeply higher. This is a different curve, of course. This corresponds to your three different vesicular radii. We see the same thing. This was for three different vesicular radii. So the bigger radius corresponds to the lowest one. The smaller radius gives you the highest curve, which is what is seen experimentally. Here, this was the smallest radius, smallest vesicle, the largest vesicle. Same here. So depending upon the interaction between the two surfaces, you can get steeply rising curves. Also, we see that serrations of larger period correspond to those which greater force, that is seen here, which is also what is seen experimentally. Also we see that for smaller radius, for larger radius, you don't see the initial curve that we saw here. This part is missing, and this is also what is seen experimentally. You don't get an initial curve here. And various other effects are able to replicate all what is all seen experimentally. Thus far, what had been reported in the literature were these kind of curves. Derenyi, Ulisher and all had done something like this. Tom Powers had done something like this, and these were statics. We are able to replicate these curves by having velocity pulling values which are at the in a regime where stick slip doesn't occur. If you pull at a large enough velocity, you are no longer in a stick slip regime.
Looking at some applications of this work in microelectronic fabrication, we'll come to it at an appropriate time.
So broadly, I am saying that we can explain all the parts of the curve. We know where each of this is coming from, and all the correct dependence of serrations due to friction, the pulling velocity dependence, the radius dependence, everything is captured. And this is one such application that I told you about initially. That's the Swedish group, Uwe Orvar. They have made these small microreactor systems where you have vesicles and nanotubules. You see these faint things, these are the nanotubules. These faint lines that you see are the nanotubes. These are micron size vesicles. They use it as microreactors.
For example, would these results okay, why did you finish? It's probably best to ask it again.
Okay, so this was an example of what is seen in a biological system. Since we don't have time, I'll just broadly go over what I was wanting to show you otherwise if you have time. Other thing was forced oscillations in micrometer systems. When you have a gas bubble trapped in a liquid, you have oscillations. This is an example of what is known as cavitation. So in submarines and all, when you want to design the propeller of a submarine, this is an important issue. You don't want your, you see these holes, right? This is not due to rust. This is because of imploding bubbles. How do you control this bubble implosion? There, implosion occurs again in the scale of nanoseconds and charges in the order of picocoulombs. And you have various models starting from Lord Rayleigh's work, motivated initially due to his work for the Royal Navy for taking care of damage to propellers in marine craft. That was an idealized work. His model was idealized. It was subsequently modified by Plessey, Prosperity and others. But strangely, no one had bothered to take care of charge in the liquid. And one would have thought that, because hydrodynamics is an ancient subject, we would have thought someone would have done it, but no one has accounted for charge in bubbles. When you have bubbles in water, they usually have a negative charge of order of a few picocoulombs. That greatly affects the dynamics. All these models ignore it. So we have included effect of charge, Q is your charge. We take into account the charge in the Plessey-Prosperity equation, solve it, and then you can look at the phase portraits. The red ones correspond to, what is it? I think it's charge system. Yeah, charge of a few picocoulombs. The blue lines correspond to the uncharged systems. They greatly vary. So this is velocity versus radius, phase portrait. These are time series, radius versus time. You can also calculate the temperature. You see temperature spikes. If you have charge on your system, the temperature is greatly enhanced, which is what is seen experimentally. And well, we are able to predict regimes. We are able to calculate the upper value of the charge that a bubble can have, things like that. So below this you have a physically permitted regime, above this you can't have charges, things like that. And we are also able to predict here something known as the Blake threshold, which is the pressure at which violent expansion of the bubble takes place. Now the collapse of this bubble takes place at what is known as your upper transient threshold, which hadn't thus far been shown. We kind of defined a quantity which is able to show both the Blake threshold as well as the upper transient critical threshold. You can see it's color coded for velocity. Beyond the upper transient threshold, you see velocity rising up steeply. So you have implosion, violent implosion taking place here. And you can kind of draw bifurcation diagrams to say how the behavior changes as a function of your bifurcation parameter, which could be charge or the driving frequency, things like this. So I'll just tell you why this was initially motivated, because you have something known as sonoluminescence. When you violently kind of force a bubble, light is emitted. So hold on. Yeah. This is from Putterman's group in UCLA. This is a gas bubble of argon, which is being excited by ultrasound. You see it expands, then it collapses, and light is emitted. That is what is known as sonoluminescence. This was the initial motivation for trying to model bubble dynamics and ultrasonics. That's how we got started. Then we found that this is not so interesting and other things are more. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you for giving me opportunity to thank Institute and all people who were behind this conference. This is 6th in a row. Obviously, I will not thank Raghavan and Prasanna because we three work together. But let me start with main funding agency. So I will like to thank National Board of Higher Mathematics who are giving us funds last 2-3 years without any problem, without asking any questions and without asking any accounts. So I'm quite happy about it and I hope they continue doing it. Then after funding, it comes to our director, Professor Sadgopan. I mean, he just told us that you just start preparing conference. Me and my whole staff and all colleagues are behind you. So that gave us a lot of confidence, calling people from outside and all. So I really thank Professor Sadgopan for showing so much confidence on us, and all his mails were extremely encouraging. I wish he was here for all 3 days. And after that, once funding is there, director is with us, we were searching for good speakers, and we really got a lot of good speakers this time. Professor Narahari is here. I really thank him for wonderful talk. But apart from him also Neeraj Kayal and Nikhil Srivastav and Binay Panda and Rohit Gupta and all. So I really thank speakers for accepting our invitation and coming and giving us beautiful and wonderful talks. I really never thought I will get exposed to so many fields. I just did number theory and I prefer to sit in office and work on my research. But I really enjoyed all these talks. So after speakers, it comes to my colleagues, faculties and also students who really took active part in this conference. And we used to feel happy, when we saw a lot of audience. We used to tell, yeah, it's working. So I really thank all of you for taking active part in our conference. Then it comes to non-academic people. So thank to Ramchandra, our registrar, who really helped us a lot. And staff like mainly Somshekhar, I will like to mention. Anytime I had phoned him, like even 11:30 in the night, and always that voice will come, yes madam, tell me what you want. So many speakers kept changing timings, and caterer kept troubling us all the time, but he really managed it well, and lot of credit goes to him. And office staff like Padma, Nirmala, Chandrika for all their cooperation. And I thank Mahesh Reddy for this. Everything was fit. Lecture was never disturbed because of any problem in laptop or this room was managed by him, and it was nice to sit in this room and attend these talks. So thanks Mahesh, and of course Swati for recording this whole conference. She came on Sunday also. I mean, even we were reluctant to get up early morning and coming, but when I came, I saw her and I was impressed. I really thank Swati. I know how difficult it is. And last but not the least, these volunteers. They were like 10 hands of ours. They really worked day and night and made things run smoothly. If this conference has run smoothly, all and full credit goes to these 10 volunteers. So really, big thanks to you guys. And in fact, they bunk classes, and I believe they take turns of bunking classes, and then they manage whole thing. But it was extremely smooth, and thanks a lot, and hope to meet you again next year. Yeah, thanks.